Hello everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. I don't give one iota. Introducing the Internet of Things Attack Methodology. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute. If during this webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We will be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Jason Blanchard of the SANS Institute.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I've gotten a chance to see this talk twice. I saw it at DerbyCon last year, and I got a chance to see it at Hackfest that takes place each year around November time, the SANS does. And every time I love when Larry teaches. If I ever get the chance, I sit in on his classes during SANS conferences, and I watch him on Security Weekly. So if you've ever gotten a chance to hear Larry talk, or if you've ever seen him on Security Weekly, one, he's probably the nicest person. Like when I first got into InfoSec, I came across Larry and I was like, he's incredibly nice. What a wonderful person. And then through social media, I've gotten a chance to see him. He's a fantastic cook, he's a great father, and he's a great presenter. And thank you so much for joining us today. Larry, I'd like to turn it over to you so that you can teach us something.
Well, hopefully I can teach you all something. And Jason, thank you very much for the warm welcome. And it's a pleasure to do these types of things for everyone. The community has given so much to me that it feels very much like I get to give back. Every week that I do the podcast and do these types of things. Excuse me. So it's lots of fun to do. So why don't we get right to it? And Jason, thanks again for the great introduction. My name is Larry Pesce. You can find me at Hacker the Matrix on Twitter. I'm the Director of Research and a Senior Managing Security Consultant for Ian Guardians, and also a SANS instructor. Amongst other things, I do lots of penetration testing of all varieties, including penetration testing on the hardware side, where we take stuff apart and return it to our customers in a cardboard box in much smaller pieces. I also do a lot of radio stuff. I'm a ham radio operator with my extra class ham radio license here in the US. And I like to play with software-defined radios. In fact, my Lime SDR that came out of the crowd supply Kickstarter type thing arrived a few days ago and is sitting here on my desk, and I keep drooling over it because I don't have the antenna connectors for it yet. I didn't order them. Silly me. I've also written a couple of books with some of my friends for Singress and a few others as well, and done all sorts of fun stuff there. As you may have heard before the podcast, Jason mentioned Security Weekly, in which Paul and I started that. We're going into our 11th year, headed towards our 12th, and 500 and something plus episodes at this point. My wife also tells me I'm really bad at selfies, and apparently just a juxtaposition in this case is also the case. So let's start talking about the Internet of Things attack methodology, and to do that, I want to make sure that we've got some sort of level playing field as to what IoT is and where we need to start thinking about assessing that. And I've got lots to cover, but as Carol did mention, we'll attempt to get some Q&A in here at the end. But if you have a question, don't hesitate to throw it in the Q&A section of the GoToWebinar panel. And if I see it in time, I'll try to address them in line, and I don't mind doing that. So don't hold your questions for the end. Get them in, and if I can address them when it's very much salient and right at the time, I'm happy to do so. So looking at the Internet of Things, there's lots of ways in which folks have tried to describe it. And in fact, NIST, the National Institute of Standards, has said that They've had more than 20 professional and research groups work to characterize what makes up the Internet of Things, and they're unable to come up with an agreement as to sort of what IoT is, and I'm very much in agreement with those types of things, because and even just in recent months, IoT has sort of exploded, and we're seeing all sorts of different types of devices. But to me, IoT has some history to it. We started talking on the podcast nearly 11 years ago about insecurities in various what was referred to as embedded devices. It was a small embedded computer in a device that was connected to your network that did something, and some of those were things along the lines of IP-based cameras, barcode scanners, and our favorite at the time were printers. And if we think about those devices when they come to the forefront now, we may very much consider those Internet of Things type devices. But we're finding that more and more types of devices that we're finding on our networks in both our enterprise and our homes are getting lumped into that IoT category. And as a result that we're seeing more and more of these types of things, the definition is beginning to change. Hey, Jeff Voss, and I apologize, Jeff, if I've butchered your name, at the National Institute of Standards, says that there's no analytic or even descriptive set of building blocks that govern the operation, trustworthiness, and life cycle of IoT components. And I think that's kind of interesting, in that what I think Jeff is really saying is that there's a lack of standardization and potential security issues, there's no lack of security issues, lack of security focus on all of the components for the IoT lifecycle, from chip manufacturer onto delivery to customer. And there, at the time when Jeff made this quote, there wasn't a lot of prescriptive analysis or prescriptive advice to give to folks to fix that. So what NIST did was they tried to define a little bit of what this process and what some of this stuff should look like, as well as attempting to define what made up IoT. Their special publication 800-183 talks about 5 primitives or components of an IoT of the Internet of Things. And those involved a sensor, aggregator, communication channel, external utility, and a decision trigger. Well, this is great. I'm glad that NIST took a stand and decided to try to define these types of things. But for me, it talks more about this at very much the forest level, and that I think talking about the Internet of Things at this level, specifically when we're talking about some security professionals and folks that have to administer these types of things at both home and in the enterprise, I think there's a lot missing. And I get that they have an external utility and a communication channel, but doesn't really describe for us how this is really working down in the weeds, and that they're missing, quote, the forest for the trees. Ultimately, what I think that NIST described instead of an Internet of Things is that they described a network of things, and describes more the network and how things should form networks and be redundant, and how some high-level things should communicate on this, as opposed to less about the really technical components. Neil Struther from Navigant Consulting congratulated NIST on saying that these guys are doing the real great thing, and that they're trying to categorize how we should be looking at interaction of these devices on an IoT network. NIST, you've done a great job. You've set the bar for smart grid interoperability, and now doing this at the IoT level is great. And can this be the catalyst needed to help drive the emerging IoT market? Sure, it doesn't hurt. And well, that's good, but now how do we get security involved? Okay, so I agree with NIST's 5 components from a high level. But for me as a security professional and someone that is potentially tearing apart these devices and analyzing the traffic and thinking about how all these things work, it is very much generic and vague and doesn't give me the detail that I need. I think about the technical components that make up each one of these types of devices that we use for IoT. And if we think about what we use when we're potentially interacting with an IoT type device, we're talking about our cell phone or our iPad or some sort of tablet, the operating system on it, an app that works with that over some network, ultimately touching a, quote, the IoT piece of hardware that does some control thing in our environment, the firmware that runs on, the cloud services. There's so many potential moving parts for this little IoT device. If I think about that, I mean, I've got a set of Christmas lights that I picked up at the local big box hardware store a year or so ago, and it uses a wireless technology to communicate with my smartphone, which gets an app downloaded from the cloud, and we can save settings, and then there's firmware and there's hardware on the set of lights, and there's lots of moving parts. And some of those moving parts are not even necessarily in my home or sitting here on my desk. So what I see this whole thing end to end is a massively connected ecosystem. So I view the Internet of Things as this ecosystem of parts that get assembled to perform some function. And we're going to see sort of how this ecosystem moves on. Okay. So what's the market for IoT look like? Well, I would agree that this is something that's not going to go away anytime soon. The Internet of Things is making all of our stuff more convenient to use, and in sometimes potentially downright scary. I'm reading tweets from Mr. Ed Scotus that, well, now only does he not have Siri to do home control in his office, that he also has as an Amazon Echo with Alexa, and potentially soon to be Google and Cortana as well. I mean, how many AIs do you really need in your home? So the fact that Ed has 2 different AIs in his home indicates to me that this is probably not something that's going to go away anytime soon, and we're becoming more and more connected. By taking these more and more connected things, we're relinquishing more and more physical control to a device that we can potentially manipulate from our mobile device, allegedly anywhere on the planet. And every one of these devices has something in there that is going to collect some data. And Jason Blanchard's telling me that he made his Amazon Dot say something. So Jason, to that, Alexa, order me a case of pork rinds. Confirm order. We'll see how that works for him. But there's tons of data. Pork rinds are great, Jason. You get the microwavable ones. I should have specified. But there's tons and tons of data that we can use through all of these IoT devices. And the fact that I potentially just ordered Jason pork rinds, well, that starts to become kind of interesting, and I'll show that to you in 1 second. Okay, so Verizon says, what does this whole market look like that, allegedly isn't going away? So more and more things, ranging from remotely programmable home thermostats and wearable health and fitness devices to aircraft jet engines, oh my, and the nation's power grid will be added to the Internet every day. Devices, connectivity, and IT services will make up the majority of the projected 1.3 trillion IoT market in 2019, just 2 years away. 1.3 trillion. With a T. That's a lot of money. And that's a lot of IoT devices. Yikes. So, when it all goes wrong with all of these IoT devices. So, the data that gets acquired from some of these devices, think about the data that's being collected, and they're selling these devices in many cases allegedly fairly cheap or fairly inexpensively because there's some data sharing that goes on, whether you know it or not. And there's been some recent cases about some of these as well, that the cost is oftentimes, I would argue, offset by the data that it collects. Okay. So the data has value to the consumer. Hey, my Fitbit just said that I ran, I ran for so long today and I did 18,000 steps. Great. The device manufacturer has some potential interest. How are they using it? You know, what's the feedback on whether things are going wrong? And potentially even the software developer has some interest into where some of the metrics are, what features folks are using, and so forth and so on. But if we start taking this data and aggregating it from multiple sources, this becomes potentially mind-boggling, and then making that data even more valuable. So imagine, if you will, that your fitness tracker talks to your fridge and then says, hey, you didn't jog today, so no, you will only open the drawer that has the yogurt and not the one with the beer. And then it also talks to your dating app, so your real scale connect to the internet talks to your dating app, so that it really doesn't lie, but let you lie about your weight on your dating app. And then your food preferences from Yelp also help your shopping list, and Untapped won't let you have a beer unless you go exercise, and won't let you leave the house if you've had too much to drink, and now knows where you go and can automatically tell you that one of your dating folks is at the bar and is planning on heading to the gym after that. This starts to become really frightening when you think about taking some of this data and aggregating it at a higher level. And then the fact that now Jason's Echo knows that it just ordered in pork rinds, let's have them report that to your healthcare provider too, because when you're not eating healthy, maybe your health insurance rates go up. That's scary. And I apologize for all of those that ordered deep fried pig skins or pork rinds on your Alexa. But and I said it again, Alexa. Paul hates it when I do this on the podcast. All right. So I never really thought this whole IoT thing would take off from much past this, what we used to refer to as embedded devices. Much like Eden Cohen never expected Idiocracy to become a documentary. And that's some of my my thoughts on that. It was intended to be a comedy, but I very much see it as potentially where the human race is going at some point in the very near future. So, but yeah, I never really expected IoT to take off like it has. And Dan Suarez, author of The Daemon, had a quote that was very much, I thought, salient to where I see IoT going now. That we're talking about $1.3 trillion. That if IoT is so successful, why haven't they taken over the world? The simple matter of the fact is that maybe it already has, just like parasites, and then that maybe we just haven't noticed. Okay. And as he puts it, that's because successful parasites don't kill us. They become part of us, making us all perform all the work to keep them alive and help them reproduce. Can you say Skynet, everyone? Yeah. No, I don't want to do any fear-mongering, but I can see that we're going to become more and more reliant on these type of technologies as time goes on. All right. So the hardest part of the impending IoT apocalypse is pretending that I'm not excited. So this stuff really, really excites me, just because there are so many new opportunities to put some of our skills that we've learned to figure out what we're going to do for some security perspective. And Brandon, no, we haven't answered yet for discovering IoT devices on the home and enterprise. But when we start thinking about what all the overall methodology for doing some testing, I think we might get some good ideas. And I don't know that there's any one given tool that will potentially do it. But that's a great thought. Okay. So let's take a look at what makes up this ecosystem of IoT devices. It starts with a device that does something. My set of Christmas lights here in my office. And then we connect it to a network. We then now, great, what does it do if it's connected to a network? Well, maybe not a whole lot. We need to be able to control that, so we want to be able to make that convenient, so we have a mobile app to connect to our device in some way, shape, or form, maybe through a cloud-hosted service to interact with that app so that we can do profiles and have a community around that. And then there's when we use it and we change the settings on our lights at any given time, and we can give feedback and what we do with it and what data it collects so that we can get better reporting. If it's something other than a set of Christmas lights, it has some really great data to it. Then there's some data aggregation, and then those folks that are hosting the services where the data aggregation happens have some databases, and then they take those databases and they take that data and they potentially do some monetization with that, so they do some B2B sharing of some variety. So yeah, that becomes pretty complex. And it only takes one part of this entire ecosystem to go sideways. And we think about something that's happened fairly recently was the Mirai botnet. And it was a worm that found digital video recorders that had Telnet open and exposed to the internet with default passwords, compromise those DVRs, and then starts launching distributed denial of service attacks and other type of attacks as well. In the case of the Mirai botnet, it was particularly scary in that it was used to take Brian Krebs' website offline with a sustained 620 gigabits of traffic. And this was direct connection, no amplification. So they were every packet that was sent there, and not amplified by doing one packet to a DNS server and having the DNS server send 300 packets in response. So the part that's scary is that was twice the size of Akamai's previously observed denial of service attack. And that one that it was twice as large as, at 310 gigabits, was one that was done with amplification. And that was sustained with only 305,000 roughly DVRs or devices. These devices are scary. At episode 500 about a month ago at Security Weekly, Allison Nixon was able to bring one of these devices and we got to play with it a little bit. And the devices are absolutely terrifying from a software development and a software standpoint. The devices are read-only. You can change some settings, but they don't survive a reboot, including the fact that they go into the menu and you change it from Chinese to English language. And in order to do that in the interface, it requires a reboot. But because there's no writable area of the disk, that setting cannot get written to disk, so when it reboots, it's back in Chinese again. So much fail on the software development portion on this. Okay. Great. So Wayne, I see your question. I want to talk about that, but I want to let that one go for just a little bit. Yeah, about some management on the FCC. So that one thing, that one IoT device. Oh, look at the cute little panda. My kids have one of these pandas. Yeah, we've played with a couple of these and done some very interesting dissection on some of this stuff, and we're still working on it. But yeah, you take this one little internet-connected panda, and well, that turns into this small portion of an ecosystem, right? So the Panda has an app that we can use to control what the Panda says and do some updates, and it's connected to a Wi-Fi network, and we can download content from the internet and the cloud, and these cloud providers, providing this additional content and the ability for us to manage some profiles for which child is playing with it. And then that cloud has this data. They have this data aggregation, and they've got some servers in the cloud, and then they're taking that data and they're doing some monetization of that. Hopefully not, given that it's kids in play here. But so that one thing turns into many things just to make this cute little teddy bear, function the way we expect it to. And then that teddy bear turns into a doll. And then we add a doll to that, and then we add our HVAC, and we add our connected Hue light bulbs and our home security, and some medical devices, and our mobile banking, and our smart car and our car charger, and then we do some online shopping through maybe one of the apps that offer in-app purchases, and then we tie that to a credit card, and then we have multiple services in the cloud doing multiple types of data aggregation on how everything is used. And I wouldn't dispute that this is far off from what my home looks like. We've got some kids' toys, we've got some HVAC, we've got some smart lights, some security system. I've got an Echo, we've got iPads, we've got Wi-Fi, we do online shopping. The only one I don't have a smart car that charges. We've got some smart energy stuff, fitness trackers, you name it. So that one thing turns into many things, which then turns into many, many things, which then start talking to each other in various ways, shapes, and form. And I probably forgot a few connections in this whole mess, and we've got the B2B up in the databases and the dollar figures and all those connected to the internet and the cloud, and our automobile talking to our charger, which is talking to the internet, which is then potentially talking to our smart energy, and our smart energy folks are doing some automatic payments. And then where does evil hacker come into all of these places that get potentially confusing? So what next? This is why testing portions of this entire IoT ecosystem is more important than ever, because we've got this big confusing mess just to make the lights turn on and off in my house, or to change the color of my Christmas lights in my office. Okay. Maybe it's a little bit overcomplicated than it need to be, but the fact that I can change the cell color of my Christmas lights from 3,000 miles away, to me, is darn sexy. But it comes with some risk. So this is where the project that I've been working on, and admittedly slowly working on, the Internet of Things attack methodology, or as I like to refer to it as IoTA. So IoTA, attack methodology. Yeah, you see what I did there? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about testing the ecosystem and some of the things that we need to do. All right. So there's a lot of components, and we'll see this when we get to the end about what we really need to do, and we've seen maybe a little bit of this already about how many actual components there are for testing all of this stuff and what some of the methodology entails. So this gets really deep really fast. And as part of IoTA, what we're looking to accomplish at the end is the ability to offer some prescriptive advice for folks to be able to build a lab to test and hone their skills, so that when they are actually testing a device, it may not necessarily be the first time they've ever had hands-on with some of the portions of the ecosystem. All right, so I see this whole IoTA ecosystem as really having sort of 5 environments: hardware, web app, mobile app, network, and some API or API type of services. So being able to interact with the devices outside of the mobile app or the web app, and being able to do that directly, which all are potentially coded different and have some different methods and some different security features applied or not. Okay. So with the hardware, there's a couple of different things that we find, and it's, again, not all inclusive here, but I think from a hardware perspective that there's a hardware device that has some firmware running on it. It potentially has some sort of radio in it, whether it be proprietary, Wi-Fi, and we've seen a massive increase in Bluetooth Low Energy as opposed to some of the other competing technologies, something like Zigbee. Oftentimes we will be interacting with a web app hosted in a cloud to do account management and looking at the nice sexy dashboards that tell us how many miles we ran today. We're potentially interacting with the devices or that quote web app dashboard on a mobile device with a mobile app. Josh did some great stuff with his ghost hunting stuff for mobile apps, and I look at the 2 major platforms, iOS for Apple and Android, because few and far between for Windows Phone and BlackBerry, but the 2 market leaders there. And then all of those things are connected somewhere, potentially, whether it be in a cloud environment or in a data center, and or traditional protocols going over something like Wi-Fi. And all of those services, the web server, the databases, all of the workstations that are being used to interact with those devices, and then other companies. So we're talking traditional networks, routers, switches, firewalls, web servers, database servers, and so forth and so on, more along the traditional sort of network-based pen test. And then finally the API, the ability to interact with those various either web app, cloud-based services, mobile apps, you name it, or potentially even the device itself outside of the norm in a programmatic interface. And it has been very much my experience with some limited API stuff that the security implementation on the API is different than what is exposed to the user in either the web app or the mobile app. And in many cases, less restrictive and potentially a problem. So let's take a look at some of these environments. So the first one that I think that everybody thinks about from an IoT device is in fact the device itself. Something that I can put my hands on, something I mount on the wall, something I screw into an electrical outlet, something I plug in. So that's the bit that I think everybody finds is, they define as the IoT, as the Internet of Things, yet there's so many other components behind it. But this is still a valid method for attack, for potentially attacking all of those other situations. It's an entry point, and it's an entry point that from the manufacturers of IoT devices that they are putting into an environment with their customers, and they have, as soon as it leaves the manufacturing facility in that nice pretty box and it goes to the retail location, they have lost control of that device. It's now up to the user. Do they smash it with a hammer? Do they open it up? Do they look inside? What can they do with it once it's been opened? And then what data has been left behind? So thinking about what data is there and is left behind, we need to start thinking about how we can interact with the hardware. We're talking hardware hacking. We're going to need some hand tools. In some cases, we're going to need some potential security bits to open up these devices, pliers, cutters of various types, a soldering iron, lots of tools to be able to get access into the device to take it apart. In fact, one of those teddy bears, I actually needed a pair of scissors and a stitch ripper. Okay, so some of those you may know what those are. Once we've got it open, how can we interact with the devices, the things on the boards in there? We'll often find TTL level and potentially serial RS-232. We'll need some adapters there. We may be looking at JTAG, the Joint Test Action Group interface connector for interacting directly with potential memory and the processor. The various buses that are floating around on the board for devices to communicate between each other, looking at SPI or I2C. We now need some tools to interact with those. So TTL and RS-232 adapters. The GoodFET is a very inexpensive option. Also the Bus Pirate is an inexpensive option for dealing with a good portion of those protocols as well. A little bit more expensive, we can be looking at the total phase aardvark for dealing with JTAG, the Celia Logic in its various sizes. I love my Celia Logic Analyzer. Does all sorts of fun stuff, including JTAG, I2C, SPI, serial, you name it. And if we're really going to be, down in the bits about it, a traditional oscilloscope can potentially also help us out as well. Some other things, thinking about how we can interact with hardware, various Wi-Fi adapters for capturing or interacting with the Wi-Fi on board, software-defined radio for picking up signals for something that may be considered more proprietary, some various Bluetooth dongles to interact with the devices and do some Bluetooth low energy hacking as well. We've got the device apart. What are all the numbers on all of these chips? What do they mean? So go to the internet and find the data sheets for deciphering the pinouts and the capabilities, and then attempting to interact with them with all of these types of tools. And my thing is that don't practice your first time on the really expensive stuff. Like, don't go and take your TV off the living room wall and start hacking away looking for JTAG ports, because when you blow it up, you blew up your TV. And well, some might argue that blowing up your TV is a good thing anyways, but practice on some cheap stuff, and that's exactly what you're going to find if you're going to do some of this testing, is you never know what you're going to get. So, find some inexpensive toys, someplace like Deal Extreme, Alibaba, any of the quote import sites that have got really cheap gear. And I go down this route, and then Deal Extreme loves my wallet, and I go there and I'm looking for like a cable, and sure enough I see, whoa, $15 Android 7-inch tablet. I'll order two, because what if the first one's broken when it comes here from China? And then I've got a spare, and it only costs me $30, because that's half the price of any decent tablet, or any halfway decent tablet I'd get here. And then, of course, I'd shop for the tablet, and they say, we think you might also enjoy. And next thing you know, I have a $600 shopping cart at Deal Extreme. So be careful. Learn from my mistakes. But some great ways to find some really cheap stuff to play with. Firmware from those devices, we can potentially start using those JTAG ports for pulling firmware from the device and pulling memory from those devices and doing analysis of that. Let's interact with the Wi-Fi network or the wired network upstream of that and see if we can capture it going past when it does an update, or maybe we pull it right down from the manufacturer's website. Maybe we're even seeing the URL in which one of these devices, by monitoring network traffic, pulls it from, and we can go get it itself. There's bunches of ways we can do some of this type of stuff. We can do some manual extraction and attempt to mount it as a file system. My favorite way to do that on Linux. We then start talking about doing some file system type forensics. Bin walk and memory acquisition and analysis tools from when we're pulling memory from the devices and what's stored there. Traditional type of forensics type of techniques for pulling these images apart, finding what's on the file system and what's from memory. Then we start doing analysis of what we find. We start looking at the configuration files for the system. If it's a POSIX-based Unix one, what did they leave behind in some plaintext configuration files? Maybe we get the Etsy shadow file for the default accounts that are on the device and run those through some password cracking. One of the things that I see time and time again when we start looking at all of these consumer routers, Wi-Fi routers that are out there, is that folks pull apart the firmware and they start inspecting all of the web pages that are there for the management interface and finding logic flaws and looking for those there. So some potential programming and some web-based stuff as well. All right, board analysis. JTAG is great for recovering the firmware and memory from the devices. We can potentially pull passwords, device configuration. We move to memory and file system stuff as well, we just mentioned. We can also start interacting with these devices when they're in use and seeing what data is being sent across the various buses when they're in use. So if we can observe the processor talking to the Wi-Fi chip on boot and during use, we can now potentially capture the commands that are being sent to the Wi-Fi chip so that we can determine how the Wi-Fi chip is being set up every time when turned on, so that we know what the configuration is. This becomes particularly helpful when we're talking about some of the proprietary radio. That the proprietary radio chip, or for the proprietary wireless methodology, is probably going to be based on a standard chip that supports multiple ways of doing things. And if we can observe how it's being told that it needs to start operating, we now have the ability to have some better insight as to how we need to reverse engineer those protocols. And we also talked about pulling some firmware from the manufacturer of the device as well. Okay. Radio analysis becomes lots of fun and is very much a rabbit hole that you can go down using a software-defined radio of some variety. I'm a huge fan of the RTL SDR because it's cheap and inexpensive for getting someone introduced to it, and some various tools with GNU Radio, GNU Radio Companion, and GQRX. Some other fun stuff for the 900 and I want to say 433 megahertz is the Yardstick 1, or the quote DONS dongle, which is the CC1111, the dev board version of the Yardstick 1, using the RFCat firmware. The semi-proprietary stuff runs us down the rabbit hole because there's so many potential protocols that we could be running here, whether it be something that works for the Nordic NRF LO1+, which supports various protocols, Z-Wave, Zigbee, LoRa, use something like wireless HART, which is more used in the ICS space, but all sorts of fun stuff. And depending on what we end up with, it will, from an analysis perspective, it may be good to pick up some individual development kits to interact with these specific modules so that we can build our own code attack tools. Okay. So some things to think about is what happens when we capture and replay some of those traffics to the devices once we've got there, either with or without modification, and seeing how that works. Okay. Wi-Fi, stand up our own access point, make it code clean. Make sure there's only one thing on that Wi-Fi network, and then grab some traffic with upstream from that. So on a code clean network, so that we're only seeing that for the one device. Some other stuff, capture what it does in the air and what is it susceptible in the air, and take a look and see what it does during various activities. What does it do? Where does it connect to on boot? What does it do during normal use? Like say when your kids are playing with a toy, where does it reach out to? What happens when you start attacking it? Does it attempt to do any fail-safes and try to pull secondary backup copies? And when you're messing with the bus and it's connected to the network, does it do anything different there? Some other things, let it just sit there and see what happens. Where does it ping out to every once in a while? And this is becoming more and more interesting. Okay, I don't think that Wi-Fi analysis is terribly great here because it's for the most part all standards-based, unless the network is defined by the manufacturer. I just picked up a set of Arlo cameras from Netgear, and they come with their own access point. Netgear created the network for those cameras. That would be one case where I want to look at the Wi-Fi network itself. Okay. What are they doing and where is it potentially vulnerable? So necessarily looking at it as a client if you're defining the network, to me, less interesting. Okay, Bluetooth is kind of hard. Bluetooth low energy is frightening, and I'm learning more and more about Bluetooth low energy as days go on. Some of my favorite tools are the Ubertooth 1 and a standard Bluetooth low energy dongle. Most Bluetooth dongles nowadays that you're going to buy that are modern are going to support Bluetooth low energy. Okay. Let's discover devices, which is insanely easy for Bluetooth low energy. Let's listen to the traffic, replay it, see what happens, maybe modify and consider replaying it. Let's interact with the public services that are available on devices, Bluetooth or Bluetooth low energy, interact with them on default pins. Use the built-in Unix stuff to start interacting with them, such as SDP tool, HCI tool for both Bluetooth EDR and low energy. Look at the Ubertooth suite. The BLE suite and BLE replay are also some really fun stuff for low energy. If we find one, connect to it. If we can't connect to it, let's capture it pairing and recover the key with Crackle. And then once we are able to interact with it, especially Bluetooth low energy, let's see what's there and then what happens when we quote fuzz and read-write values to various locations. So fun stuff there. Okay. On the web app side, well, we think this should be fairly simple. I mean, we've been, as an industry, we've been doing web app stuff for quite some time. In reality, what you need for doing some web app testing is a web browser and time and creativity. Of course, being able to speed that up with something like a proxy, such as Burp proxy, Zap proxy, Zed on the Mac, I think, if I remember correctly, Charles proxy, some other stuff, depending on where these cloud services are living and what they're doing. Derby, Derbuster, WP Scan, I hate that I have to say this in an IoT context, but WordPress Scanner, SQL Map, once we find some stuff, curl and wget, and also interacting with Python may also be helpful. Okay. Do we need some targets for practice to put in our lab? Absolutely. There's all sorts of fun stuff out there. Matilda, Hack Me Bank, a bunch of stuff from the OWASP project. Oh, and by the way, Bug bounty programs. Yes, in many cases, the bug bounty programs that you can get involved with folks like HackerOne and so forth and so on, many of the companies that are signed up there have web applications that are in scope that you're, quote, allowed to beat on, and if you find something, you might actually get paid for it. Awesome. Okay, so sorry, just taking a look through some of the questions there, and absolutely, and Carolyn, I'd have to think about your question a little bit further. That on some reverse engineering concerns with the tricked out launch of tools, and how can we incorporate security and ethics as a part of the architecture for IoT, so that stuff that gets built can survive our analysis. Yeah, that's a really good one, and I don't know if there's a lot of good solutions there currently, but let's push that a little bit to the end, and I'd love to be reminded about that because I do have a bunch yet to get through to give you the whole analysis, and I'll try to speed that up a little bit. But real quick, if you can lock out JTAG when it gets sent and blow the fuses for JTAG so that it can't be used when it leaves the factory, that would be huge. The other one is and I know this is incredibly difficult, if you can encrypt anything on those buses and no JTAG at the same time, that would be my ideal world, but from a manufacturing perspective and from a capabilities perspective, I know that some of this is a lot harder than it actually seems, and is something that is potentially going to be for the future. Just thinking about that from an initial stab, and that might be my thing that I would think. But absolutely, make sure we follow up on that as well. Okay. So web app in practice, lots of fun stuff to be found: cross-site scripting, SQL injection, cross-site request forgery, session token manipulation, modification, expiration. Entropy calculations. Are the sessions sequentially numbered? Can I just change my session ID and I'm someone else? Can we access stuff unauthenticated that I shouldn't be? Can we change those sessions and then move to escalation of privileges, whether it be to another user or to an administrative user? Can we manipulate data outside of some other device that doesn't have the bounds checking? Are they doing the bounds checking in JavaScript in the browser? Can we do directory traversal, command injection, all sorts of fun stuff there? Okay. So on the mobile side, I see a lot of times the mobile side, the interaction over the network is very similar to a glorified web app that's rendered in a different browser. However, the apps themselves, depending on the capabilities, can also become very interesting. Okay. I find that in many cases, specifically on the iOS side, that in many cases we don't have the source code, so actually having a real device for us to analyze, and sometimes I just find real hardware is the way to go. We can only sometimes do so far with emulation. So getting a hold of an actual device, order the cheap ones for Android from China, and for something like Deal Extreme, getting multiple iOS devices. They don't necessarily have to be the latest and the greatest. I've got my old iPhone 4 sitting on my desk here that I used for analysis. We can do some emulation for Android, and most of the cases that works really well. It's difficult to do for iOS just because of the processor architecture. The latest and the greatest also may not give you the ability to jailbreak to do the best analysis as well, and some of the hand-me-downs from friends are perfectly suitable here. Some good tools: IDA Pro, a little expensive; Hopper, IDB, Frida, MobSF, a file system browser, SSH, and a terminal. Some of those as we start going down the list, they get cheaper and cheaper. Want some experience? Want a lab? Pick an app that interests you and go to town. This was exactly what Mr. Wright did when he did his presentation on these ghost hunter apps. He wanted to see if they were real. So he found some, and he found a bunch of stuff. Now, if you find stuff, report it to the bug bounty and do some responsible disclosure, please. Okay, let's be good stewards. In practice, shut off the cellular, make it connect to Wi-Fi, and connect all the traffic and examine the traffic. Let's respond to both the devices and the web servers with malformed values with a proxy. Use some of these values directly within the web app itself. Capture credentials, hashes, cookies, and then potentially try to use those with other services that have less security, such as the API. What's in the configuration on disk on these devices? Pull them off the device, do some analysis of the code itself, what's in the file system for these as well. And then once we feed data back to the apps, i.e. the responses from the web server that they're interacting with or the API that they're interacting with, what happens when we give them malformed data to the app itself as opposed to the web server? So what happens with the responses? Are they doing bounds checking on the responses? Okay. Network pen testing, over here on the right is my my interpretation of pen testing. It's a piece of paper that someone scribbled on with a pen. Okay, so there are many volumes to be said about network pen testing. I'd argue that there are probably 3 or 4 SANS classes that could talk about network-based pen testing in all its varieties. So 3 to 6 slides really won't do this justice. But I see the network pen testing to be both internal, business-to-business, cloud, you know, in all its varieties, AWS, you name it. But the infrastructure in many cases is the same. What does the scenario often looks like? You're working from an insider threat or assumed compromised, or some sort of determined attacker, industrial espionage, or quote, nation state. And I think that nation state line is starting to blur a little bit. So my thing that I like is go build your own lab for networking stuff. You know, ESX server on inexpensive hardware from eBay, put some Linux stuff there, do some stuff with MSDN or its new variety, whatever that is, to get Windows licensing and use them for 60 days and revert them. Build an infrastructure, build a network, see what it looks like, and all of the parts, including databases and so forth. If you need to do some real hardware, because I know sometimes just virtualized hardware won't work, even consider going small and cheap with something like a Raspberry Pi, a BeagleBone, or an Odroid. Okay. And on the network side, when we start talking network protocols, consider what the folks use for the Cisco CCIE labs and the various emulation, because I'd argue you can only do so much networking protocols in ESX virtual networking, and sometimes you actually want to see what VRRP looks like on a network and how you can interact with it, which you may be finding in some of these quote cloud data centers or some of the data centers that are not cloud-based where all of this data is getting aggregated. Okay. On the external side, what can your customers see when you're manufacturing an IoT device and you're supporting all these cloud services? What can they see? This gets lots of fun. We start doing some open source intelligence, some scanning and enumeration with Nmap, DNS Recon, Nessus, so forth and so on. Shodan and Census are also great for some of this stuff. Again, some similar things to some of the internal type of stuff. We think about some exploitation and command and control, and very much it ends up being simple in many of the cases. Exploitation with something like Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, social engineering, phishing, and password spraying are huge. Build your test environments for something like this, either in your ESX environment, build it like you'd be building a network with a DMZ and stand up a separate one, or put it in a separate little container in your ESX server, or stand one up at AWS in some of their free tiers and then notify them that you're going to be doing this type of testing. Okay. So lots of ways for us to build a lab there. Okay. So in practice, recon, scan, analyze and enumerate, exploit, pillage, find all the fun stuff there. Once you've pillaged that system, pivot using that information. Pillage again, do some more recon and scan if you're in another network, and lather, rinse, repeat over and over again, and then you get this nice big fluffy ball of mess of data. And potentially sometimes it's going to be pretty darn darn valuable. Okay, API testing. This one gets hard to build a lab for, because depending on which methodologies that your IoT provider or as a tester is using, there's no one sort of fit-all solution for being able to interact with all of this stuff. However, we've had great success with using some traditional web-based tools, depending on where we're looking at, specifically on RESTful style interfaces, helpful for understanding web app proxies, and SOAP UI and various custom tools to interact directly with those APIs. If you can find other tools and other software products that that are maybe open source that leverage the same or similar APIs for what you're testing, is a great opportunity to build some lab environment in your ESX environment. Okay. Some other things to think of is that in some cases the API stuff, the tools such as your web browser, your proxy, and something like SOAP UI may not necessarily get you everything you want the way you want it. So this is, in my opinion, where some programming is going to come into play. My favorite would be Python, and looking at which API packages and libraries are there for your programming language of choice to interact with these specific APIs. Some other ones is understanding implementations of OAuth and is SASL for authentication is also potentially really good for some of this API and web application stuff as well. Okay, so in practice, figure out which type of language it was done in. Is it some binary HTTP, binary over HTTP, something custom? Is it JSON? Is it a RESTful interface? XML SOAP, is it modified XML? Every one of these is going to provide its own unique challenges, and arguably I think this is probably some of the hardest stuff, given that there's so many options here for folks to potentially, to use a bad word, bastardize some of the standards here to make them fit what they want, and in some of the cases less, in my opinion, less easy to interact with. All right, so I'm running a little long in the tooth, and I want to make sure that I get all of your questions here. So I want to wrap up with some conclusion and make sure I've got some time for questions. So in conclusion, whoa, that was a lot of components in an ecosystem that we just looked at, and this is going, whoa, I know Kung Fu. We now maybe have an understanding of all the complexity that goes into an IoT environment. And well, that's huge. So what do we need? We need some training. And in fact, when Trinity needs some training, all she did was she pulled out her cell phone and told Tank that she needed a pilot program for a military M109 helicopter. M109, sorry, things covering. Yeah, M109 helicopter. And it was that easy for her. Yeah, it's not always that easy. Okay. So in my opinion, full scope Internet of Things penetration testing it encompasses many disciplines. We talked about web app, we talked about hardware, firmware, wireless, Bluetooth, proprietary radio protocols, network, you name it. So many disciplines and volumes of knowledge. I mean, for me, I don't think this is anything that any one person could be an expert in all of these areas. So what happens? You go through the metal detector, and the metal detector beeps. Neo and Trinity going through the metal detector, and the guard yells, holy, because why? They've got tons of guns on their person in a bag. They've come fully armed and as part of a team. So don't go into this testing alone. Build a diverse, capable team to do some of this type of testing, because it runs against multiple diverse methodologies and areas of focus. So build yourself a team, and in this case it was a team of 2, but they went and kicked butt because they trained and they built that team with the 2 of them, and they had lots of specialized knowledge. Okay, But my argument is that together, if we are all starting to think about what makes up IoT from this ecosystem, from all of the components that get designed and or on our networks, we can help build a better ecosystem by being proactive. And we can maybe, hopefully, start to steer some of the manufacturers down the right road for doing some of this as well. Okay, so we talked about the IoTA and this methodology and expounding upon a lot of the more of the technical details in this 1-hour talk. Well, we attempted to release IoTA at our website, inguardians.com/IoTA. And turns out this is a massive undertaking, and it's largely my baby, and I'm the one that is largely responsible for it. And I hate to say it, but I bit off a little bit more than I could chew. We were planning on being able to release the full document around the first of the year, and that didn't happen. So my thing to you is that what we want to do in the next coming months in a very short time frame, we want to release what we have and follow the release early and release often mantra, in that we want to get something to the industry so that you guys can start and you can offer suggestions and maybe even help out. Because quite honestly, I bit off more than I could chew. But when it's there, when it is, inguardians.com/IoTA, coming soon, and again, it's not complete, but we need to start going down the path and start getting people thinking about it and potentially even helping. So that's where we can start finding some of this stuff very soon. So again, I'm right at 4 o'clock. Thank you all for coming and hanging around with me and listening to me speak about IoT stuff. I did just want to address a question from Brandon about some tools to help discover IoT devices in home and enterprise environments. I seem to remember in the back of my mind that there was a tool, and I'm forgetting where it was. It may be Symantec that has one. This is something that is definitely a thing that I think is in need in the industry, and that, stay tuned, because there are a lot of folks out there that don't realize that they have this type of stuff. Okay. Wayne's question on what about a solutions for how regulating IoT, something like the FCC does. Paul and I on the podcast have gone back and forth about whether we think regulation is good, and I'm of the opinion that maybe some regulation that a pen test has to be done before some of the stuff gets to market is a good idea. Paul, not so much, but I think it's something that we're probably going to end up seeing is some sort of government regulation, but it's probably going to fall far from the mark. Okay. And from Andrew, how much of this attack methodology can be applied to ICS stuff? I would argue that a great portion of the this could be applied to ICS, in that the initial basis of the document comes out of specifically InGuardian's experience dealing with ICS and smart energy, and the methodology that we helped develop for that as well, and expounding on that, and in many cases expounding on that very much how smart energy has evolved into some of these places as well. So I think it would be very salient for these types of things as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Carol so that she can close it out. And again, thank you all for coming.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Larry, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.